Good morning again, ladies and gentlemen, here in Santa Clara, California, day 2, Cloud Expo. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, if you're following us out there on the World Wide Web. Next session, cloud security, obviously security recurring theme all 4 days this week. Where would you look if you want a great speaker on cloud security? How about the guy who launched the first web-based email consumer service? That might be somewhere to look. Luckily, we have him. McAfee also have him. They snapped him up from MX Logic during their acquisition in 2009. So let's give it up for one of the best experts in the world on cloud security, Scott Chasin, CTO now of McAfee's cloud and content, everything. He's going to tell us. Welcome aboard.
Thank you.
Enjoy.
Yes. Okay, good morning. Hopefully everybody's awake. They've had some coffee. So I have an interesting presentation for you. It might take some time. If you can't see it, you might have to squint a little bit. So I'm going to go through this, give you a kind of a good background on the direction of where I think the cloud is going. So we'll start with the top left, and then we'll just work. I'm kidding, by the way. It's too early for this. Are you kidding me? Look at this slide. I forget which blog it was, but somebody voted this as the worst PowerPoint slide that man has ever created, and I think I have to agree. So the good thing is that I've got a very simple presentation for you. This is the agenda. This is maybe one of 2 slides that actually contain words. I'm not going to give you bullets, okay? So you can sit back and you can just consume the images that I'm going to show you and listen to a story about how identity is going to essentially change not only the cloud security landscape, but security in general. So obviously I'm going to talk about the cloud. I'm going to talk about consumerization. I'm going to talk about mobile. I'm going to talk about social. And if anybody can come up with a really cool acronym for all 4 of these, let me know. Because I think this is a convergence horizon which is going to change a lot of things in security. So again, welcome everybody. My name is Scott Chasin. I'm the CTO of McAfee's cloud security business. As was mentioned, I came to McAfee through an acquisition that they made of MX Logic. Before that, a company I started called USA.net. We introduced web-based email in 1995. Before that, I did something called BugTrack. A lot of experience in information security, collaboration, the net in general. The interesting thing that I think we all realize is that the internet was built with a default allow all foundation, right? Everybody's invited, everybody can come participate. Security was an afterthought. And obviously that led to a lot of bad stuff. Now, to take you through some of the history here, because I think it's important to frame up, just how this default allow all, especially with, firewalls and TCP/IP and sockets and everything. This is, and if you can see this, hopefully you can. This is the Internet Manager's Phone Book, produced by BBN in the late 80s. This was an actual phone book, okay? And listed in this was every single domain name that existed, along with the IT manager that was responsible for that node on the internet. Imagine that. It was about 100 plus pages. It also contained the IP addresses of each of these nodes, right? So think about that. It's kind of interesting that at one point in time, there was a phone book for the internet that listed all the important sites, or at least all of the sites that had domain names and C-class addresses, etc. And then something bad happened, right? Malware was introduced, or viruses back then. And all of a sudden, the world woke up to this, well, in 1989, the Morse worm, but we realized that all of this open platform technology that the internet was built on was actually a fairly bad thing. And malware started to infiltrate the network, and the virus was born. I love this clip here. A lot of scare tactics were used in the early days, but the reality is that viruses began to propagate over the internet. And then the botnet was created, right? So for those that don't know, the botnet basically started as a smart bot inside of IRC, inside of a chat room. They basically used IRC channel guys, hackers, to basically control their channel. And so this kind of client-server model, then the distributed peer-to-peer model, provided all kinds of capabilities for bad stuff to occur. And as the PC moved from the office to the kitchen and broadband became ubiquitous, the botnet started to take over as the primary means for disseminating bad stuff, malware, spam, phishing attacks, you name it. So when you look at the botnet today, it's kind of interesting. There's a lot of folks out there in industry that believe the largest cloud in the world is actually the Configure botnet. Think about that. At 1.6 million nodes versus Google's 500,000 nodes, right? Now, obviously, the industry has tackled Configure fairly well. In fact, there's a great book that just came out 2 weeks ago from Mark Bowman, the guy who wrote Black Hawk Down, that goes through, it's called Worm, that goes through the Configure botnet and talks about how industry tried to tackle it. I suggest it's a good read if you want to know more. But botnets, are the big threat to the cloud. And what happens when they start to attack, right? What happens when clouds are used to attack other clouds, or clouds are used to attack us? And this is unfortunately where the threat is going, right? We're already seeing it. So Configure and other botnets are used to send spam. They're used to hijack credentials. They're used to, keystroke log you. They're used to create distributed denial of service attacks. And we're making it easier for anybody to grab a slice of the cloud, including the bad guys, right? So through automation and provisioning, being able to use web service APIs, you can grab a slice of the cloud and use it for whatever nefarious purpose that you want. So it's a big threat, and we have to watch out for it. So I'm going to talk to you a lot about how identity is going to change a lot of the components around the security models we know it today. And I'm going to do that by first starting to talk about email. So I have a background in fighting spam for 7+ years. And if you look at the email pollution problem as it really started to get saturated over the last 7 years through the proliferation of botnets, the main arsenal that we embraced to fight it was filtering, right? This reactive capability that was only good as the last known spam message. And this is also very similar to what we do today with viruses, right? We filter based off of signatures, or we filter based off of content. But the reactive nature of how we fight security in the cloud, how we fight security in general, has got to change. Because again, it's only as good as the last known threat. And so I think that identity is going to have a big impact into that shift. So why hasn't identity been tied to email? Basically, it's part of that old legacy internet open infrastructure of default allow all. I mean, let's face it, if I have your email address, you're forced to receive whatever I send to you, right? Now, obviously, you have filters that can help filter out the bad stuff, but it's that reactive plus open infrastructure which has created this big problem that we all face with pollution across the net. I've always said that perhaps the greatest spam filter is the biometric send button. If somebody's working on this, please let me know. What I mean by that is I just want one filter in my inbox, right? Something that says this is all mail or email from humans versus machine-generated or machine-originating traffic, right? Think about that for a minute. Now, obviously, that's not going to get the large human farms that are sending mail, but for the most part, it should capture a lot of it. But it's that kind of attribute around context that's going to have a major impact to how we not only filter things out, but how security is going to change. So the reaction for filtering email has been reactive with blacklists, right? And this is pretty much security today. We have blacklists for everything. Deny lists for IP addresses, deny lists for applications, deny lists and firewalls for bad ports, deny lists for all kinds of things, right? This is the reactive nature of security. That started to change a little bit over the last 5 years with this thing called reputation. Reputation of IP addresses are now served in clearinghouse-like models that are catching 90+% of all of the bad spam traffic with email, as an example. Reputation for applications and files, even people, right? With some identities exist out there today in clearinghouse models. So reputation is one of the first contextual attributes that's starting to get served up or brokered by third parties. That's going to have, I think, that's going to start this new wave of how security is going to shift from this model that says, let's identify all of the bad actors and reactively filter it, to let's identify all the good actors and simply lock out all the bad ones by creating a network of only good actors. And so it's the approach that says it's not simply about the blacklist, but the whitelist, right? How do we start to use identity to create a network of only good collaboration nodes, of only good collaborators, and simply lock out the bad ones or balance it with this reactive filtering infrastructure that we've all built? And when I talk about the cloud is, I think, the inflection point that's going to make this happen. I think that you're going to see identities start to play a more critical role in how cloud technologies from the enterprise out and within the cloud ecosystem itself define security. But let's take a step back as we dive into the cloud a little bit more. Does anybody know what this box is, if you can see this? Yeah, it's a PDP, right? So why do I have this up there? Well, back in the day, depending on how far back you go, there was this thing called time sharing, right? Before the internet, we had something called the X25 network, where you had PDPs and other types of mainframes that were all connected via X25 pads. We had services like Sprint's Telenet and TimeNet and others. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because we had these closed environments, if you will. We had something called MCI Mail that Vint Cerf created in the 80s, which was the first enterprise collaboration email network on this X25 network. It was spam-free, it was pollution-free. It was born with all kinds of really interesting features of a closed network. I bring this up because we're going back to this type of model, right? This is truly what the cloud is becoming once again. It's where IT is going once again. And so if you look at this, you can see the evolution, right? We used to call ourselves ISPs and then managed service providers, and then ASPs, which was a bad word, became a bad word. And now here we are with the cloud. But the evolution of security is moving back to this centralized walled garden, if you will, where from end to end you have a closed loop. But the challenge, I think, of this is that everything is the cloud now, right? And I love this image because it's even the kitchen sink. Everything is going to be connected to the cloud. And this is going to change the architecture of how we build software. It's going to change how data is distributed. Does anybody know what this number is? Does anybody know what a zettabyte is? Yeah, billion terabytes. It's a big number, right? So 35 zettabytes, that's what the digital universe will be in a decade. 35 zettabytes, so that's a ton of data. If you cut this in half, that's what's going to be stored in the cloud in 10 years, and that's what's going to flow through the cloud in 10 years. So we have a big challenge. How do we protect all of this data? How do we follow the data as it goes to and through the cloud, as it's stored in the cloud? And so that's the model that we work at McAfee and now Intel. And it's, I think, really highlighted by this. Everything is going to leverage the cloud. The application architecture is going to change dramatically to leverage the cloud. And we're going to live in the world of the great mashup. So you have this application architecture, which is really represented by what's called glue, right? All web services. From a security perspective, this isn't looked at that much in depth today, right? But if you think about it, how is the enterprise integrate into the cloud? It's through web services. How do applications talk with other applications today? It's through web services. It's through XML, right? It's through SOAP. It's through, new standards like SAML for identity. It's how your mobile apps are communicating with the services that power them, right? It's how cloud slices are provisioned. I think Salesforce earlier this year came out and said that 60% of their service is consumed through their web service APIs versus their portal console. You got to think about that. This great mashup is happening, and this new application architecture is going to be extremely complex to manage. It's going to look like a bowl of spaghetti, like you have here. And your cloud provider is going to be using other cloud providers for its infrastructure services. And so there's got to be a way that not only can we secure these channels, follow the data, but also apply trust in realms of trust as this application architecture continuously gets more and more complex. So then you have this. And this is that other point of convergence. There's a couple more which I'll talk about. But consumerization, right? So you have the cloud, you have the application complexity, the mashup, and now you have the consumer, knowledge worker, enterprise employee. And from an employee perspective, there's one quote that keeps coming back in my mind, which is, why am I so powerful as a consumer and so lame as an employee, right? How come I have all the tools when I go home, but I'm limited into what I can do as an employee? And I think this is the true nature of consumerization. And when you look at consumerization, I look at it going all the way back to 1995 with the introduction of web-based email, where services like what USA.net delivered, then also Hotmail, basically empowered, enabled the knowledge worker to get access to their email through their corporate firewall, right? Their personal email. And this is exactly what happened. The employee said, well, IT, why can't I get access to my corporate mail through the firewall or wherever I'm at, right? This is web-based email, and then things like Outlook Web Access came into the fold. But it doesn't stop there. Instant messaging, same thing, right? Instant messaging born outside of the enterprise, made it into the enterprise, obviously still a consumer service today. And then even more current, Dropbox, box.net, you send it, right? Email is actually losing content for the first time. All of a sudden the world has realized that email is a horrible way to send large files and attachments. So we're seeing this shift. And obviously mobile, which I'll talk about in a minute, is also having a big impact. But when you look at the email channel as a great example of consumerization, we're seeing content move off of the enterprise exchange server. We're seeing this at really a fairly startling pace. And these services are generally seeping into the enterprise without IT blessing, right? At least they start with the consumer knowledge worker, enterprise employee, and then they slowly, virally take foot inside of the enterprise. And now we have this. Does anybody know what this is? Yeah, overnight instant branding. Gotta love it, right? The iCloud. iPhone 4, iOS 5. Now you have the cloud sync, right? not S-I-N-K, S-Y-N-C, syncing with the cloud. All of your data, iOS 5 can be basically synced into the iCloud. Very little security there from an enterprise perspective. How are you going to manage this? What does this look like? All of those issues around transparency and trust are there. So the mobile conundrum here is that we have this. We have lots and lots and lots of apps, right, that are coming in. All of them using web services to communicate to some kind of back-end service, right, to update your usage of the app, to update the app itself, to communicate with some back-end service. And what do? We don't have a real identity solution for these. And of course, it's platform dependent. There are controls on iOS that aren't on Android and vice versa. But the reputation of these apps is still unclear. And do we really need this application? I mean, the idea that you have a marketplace where apps can be downloaded and then installed on your mobile device is great, but you need the controls and the identity and reputation associated with these apps. And somebody needs to watch what these apps are doing on the back end. Again, all of these applications are speaking XML, web services, using web services APIs, whether it's RESTful or SOAP or you name it. And there's not a lot of security on these channels. Then you have this. Sharing. Everything has a share button, right? Everything can be shared today. There's all kinds of widgets out there to share across all kinds of social networks, +1, plus whatever, sharing everywhere. And that's a big threat. So you have consumerization, you have the cloud, you have social sharing, all without real identity structures, right? You have apps without reputation and apps that are somewhat moderated. But what's on the other end of these shares? What's on the other end of some of these things? And I think that's what we're getting into. We all know that the greatest weakness with security is you, right? It's me. It's the human element. It's, the greatest hacks that have been done over the last decade have all been socially engineered. It's true. Advanced persistent threats, socially engineered phishing messages, which drop malware onto your machine. It's all about social engineering. The ability for somebody to con you into clicking on a link. The ability for somebody to fool you into filling out that form that looks like your bank's authentication screen or web page. So as we start to socially enable sharing and enable mobility, and identity is still a missing fundamental from these models, where you can't tell what's on the other end of that link. You can't tell who's actually really sending that to you. We're going to have social engineering. We're going to have malware propagation. We're going to have, keystroke logging. We're going to have a security issue. Phishing is, still rampant. It's become more targeting. It's, the bad guys that now see ways to get into the enterprise through masquerading, through cloning of websites. It's where all the success is with the bad guys. So let me pause there and talk about this. Does anybody remember this instant messaging service, ICQ? Yeah? Raise your hand if you still have an ICQ account. Okay, you're strange. Right? So ICQ, I think it was sold off to a Russian investment firm, from AOL a while ago. Why am I bringing up ICQ? When I first saw what ICQ was creating in the 90s, I thought, wow, this is it. From a security perspective, I said, this is the model. Here it is, right? What is this? It's the buddy list, right? It's default deny all, but who you trust, right? This is the friends list. You know, if you think about it, this is the birth of social, right? You think about that. So ICQ, first instant messaging network out there, got you to map your friends so that you could communicate with them. Even Twitter, right? Twitter was born out of the instant messaging status line, right? The fact that you can set your status, and people with ICQ started saying, hey, I'm sleeping like this guy Ethan, or, you know, I'm eating, or that's the birth of Twitter. That's where the idea of Twitter came from. This is big because this fundamentally changed the model of security from default allow all to default deny all, but with trusted exceptions. And social grabbed onto this in a big way. I think that this is really important. I know this is overblown in a lot of ways, but from a security perspective, I think this is massive. If you think about who's the largest identity provider out there today, it's Facebook, right? 800 million people have mapped their identities and their relationships. I think that's important, right? I think that's going to have a major impact to security. If you look at the entire geo-universe, and this is a dated slide, but you know, it shows Facebook at 629 million, already at 800. You know, this is happening around the world, right? And if you believe that consumerization changes enterprise collaboration models, you have to think that there's a reason why those that are connected, those that are plugged in, are mapping out their relationships, right? It's important. And it's going beyond that. I mean, we're now opening up those social graphs to applications, right? The cloud is integrating with all of this, with everything social. And, you know, LinkedIn is another great example of how this model is being exposed, where, you know, transient trust is starting to now appear, where you can map your network, right? This means something. You know, now we're even labeling our friends, right? Think about that. So we've mapped them, and now we're labeling them. Google+, circles, right? So this is going to have an impact to security. Identity is going to lead us to trust, right? Who do you trust? What are your realms of trust? And the infrastructure is out there. Humans are creating these relationship maps, and we're labeling them now. And so the real question is, that I'm starting to ask myself is the enterprise going to start to take advantage of that, right? Is there an opportunity to start to take advantage of the shift from reactive filtering to proactive filtering based on trust models, based on trusted communities? The question is how is that going to be implemented? Is it going to be this, right? If you think about Facebook, the largest identity provider on the internet, in the cloud, are you going to log into your enterprise network with your Facebook credentials in the future? I think you will, believe it or not. Of course, you'll have to couple it with strong authentication that's seated inside the chip or that's seated inside of your enterprise. But I think it's going to happen. I think you'll have IDPs or identity providers like you have credit cards in your wallet. But everything's going to be integrated into some kind of broker, some kind of clearinghouse. Is it OAuth? Maybe. Is it SAML? Probably. It's happening now. But how do we move into trust? How do we start to build the components to create a trusted ecosystem where we can move beyond reactive filtering that's only as good as the last known threat? What do we have to do? I think the tools are all there. I mean, I really do. If you look at the directory and look at identity historically. Over the last 10 years, rewind even further, let's say the last 15 years, we've been really busy creating these directories inside of the enterprise to manage the assets that we have behind the firewall, right? The big challenge with identity over the last decade plus has been single sign-on inside of the firewall. Guess what? We've got that issue all over again with the cloud. Nobody wants another password to manage for Salesforce, right? Nobody wants another password to manage to log into SuccessFactors. So cloud single sign-on is a really big problem for the enterprise today. With all these different cloud assets that are coming to fruition. I mean, McAfee as an example, we have 80 plus SaaS providers alone, right? So how do we deal with single sign-on? Obviously, the industry has answered that with the security markup assertion language, right? SAML, security assertion markup language. And I think it's important because I think when you start to look at, the battle of the directory, along with things like social network analysis and the trust models that I just talked about, I don't think we're too far off where, the enterprise is going to have this new type of directory that maps out who they trust and what their relationships are, where context is key, all of it mapping to identity. Context being, where you are, what's your location. I think, and this is a funny slide, but I think context is everything. Context is going to define authentication models. It's going to define, the authorization capabilities that you'll have within the cloud. And so some would say that identity is just an attribute to context and a security policy. I think that it all kind of maps up to identity, where all these attributes or your identity footprints are all part of this context model. And what's interesting is that to get there, to start building this trusted ecosystem, is that we already have the tools today to do it. This is an interesting graph from Forrester, and it's kind of hard to read, but what it shows is that the channels of collaboration that you use really define who you trust, right? When you think about this. So when you text somebody on your phone, it's generally a fairly intimate, relationship that you have with somebody, for the most part, right? Versus instant messaging, which might be a kind of a step up in trust, versus email, which is, hit or miss these days, right? Largely anonymous from the pollution perspective. But the idea here is that the enterprise can see all of this traffic already today. It's all being proxied or gatewayed back out to the cloud. And so this is part of the vision here, which says that using techniques like social network analysis, the enterprise is going to be able to map their business ecosystem, right? The enterprise is going to be able to define who they communicate with, who's in their supply chain, which ultimately is going to create community clouds, right? Which is ultimately going to define a trust signaling layer in the cloud. I believe in this. I think it's going to happen. I think you'll have trusted collaboration paths that lock out the bad guys, lock out the bad actors. Using device identity, using eventually even biometrics, you'll have a secure network based on trust, which ultimately give birth to new collaboration models in and of itself. So I think it looks like this. I think you're going to see trust management as a service over the next 7 years, let's call it, where context, including reputation, including the relationship of something, including the attestation of that thing, is going to be served by a third party. It's going to be brokered by a trust as a service provider, right? And it's going to be embedded into the hardware, right? So if you look at this, you can see from your computing desktop to your car, there's billions and billions of IP-connected devices out there, right? And a client-aware cloud, you heard Intel's vision yesterday, which is our vision as well, is going to be a real thing. And all of that association needs to be brokered, right? You need to serve trust up as a third party. I don't believe that peer-to-peer models necessarily are going to be the sole way of how trust is brokered. So that said, what are we doing to get here? This is a ways out, and it really defines this big shift of security. And I guess part of the commercial here is what we announced yesterday, which is the McAfee Cloud Security Platform. This is the starting point of how we do this. Now, this is a platform play that is really the evolution of the web gateway, right? Here's an interesting thought for you. Has the web become the cloud, right? If you look at the secure web gateway market, most enterprises have a secure web gateway today that provides URL classification, content analysis for malware detection, right? Some levels of application control. That gateway is not just serving up content anymore into the enterprise. It's serving up application bits, right? This concept of the web top, you guys remember that 5 years ago? Well, is it the cloud top now? As the application suite moves into the cloud, guess what? It's all web traffic, right? It's all port 80, it's port 443, it's all HTTP. So those bits are going through a gateway. What McAfee introduced was a cloud security platform that basically took that, put data loss prevention on top of it with web security and email security, and then leveraged identity capabilities to provide strong authentication and provisioning into cloud assets. But this is the new model, right? It's all about following the data, creating a bridge from the enterprise to the cloud that can extend the enterprise security policy into your cloud assets. But again, when you think about this, there's probably 3 major streams of data flow going from the enterprise and to and through the cloud. It's web traffic, right? It's the majority of it. And it's not just from your browser, right? It's also application. We talked about that. Applications talk to other applications in the cloud through web services. It's email and collaboration traffic, which, by the way, is also very quickly moving to the web, right? Or moving to the cloud, depending on how you look at it. And then it's identity and authentication traffic. So 3 streams. So we see an opportunity to create a single proxy model where we can provide additional value by proxying those streams of traffic through a cloud security platform, the evolution of the web gateway, or the secure web gateway. So all of this, I think, ultimately starts to create the building blocks for a trust management layer. I think we're probably a decade out still, but ultimately you're going to have a third party that not only serves up the identity, and I think that could, again, probably be somebody like a Facebook, but somebody that serves up the context of who you are, what you're trying to do, and what your relationship is to not only your enterprise, but to your own social graph. Okay, that's it. I think we have time for some Q&A.
We always have time for Q&A at Cloud Expo. Now then, ladies and gentlemen, I should be giving a prize for the very first question, but I won't. You have before you. There comes a hand. Here I come. Keep me fit. Very good.
All of that sounds pretty good for some things, but sometimes I want to be anonymous. I don't want to get stuff just because somebody knows where I am and they know that I'm single. I mean, I just, if I'm shopping for a Rolex, I don't want anybody to know who I am, but that I'm real. How does that build into these biometrics and the context?
Yeah. So, whether you like it or not, unfortunately, your digital footprint is being built, right? So there are some that say in the industry that authentication is simply going to go away and that your digital footprint will be what authenticates you. Your social profile, your blog posts, your interaction with the cloud, the web, the internet in general. In fact, it's probably a good lesson to teach your kids now that having a clean social footprint or digital footprint is really important. If not, it would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But privacy is always going to be a big issue. And being able to opt out, go offline, hide yourself, I think is going to be a big challenge. I say that because we are already seeing these digital footprints being built without our permission, right? The models are out there where harvesting is occurring and you're being tracked as you surf, as you interact. But I do think that there's opportunity for security providers to provide that, invisibility, if you will. I think it's going to take time, but unfortunately, I think the default answer is you need to watch what you're opting into, and try to minimize that digital footprint so that it's fairly clean. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a very difficult question to answer, and it's one that's how do you balance security with privacy, with the value that hopefully you'll get from this technology in the end as an end user.
Yeah. Well, it's a stab at an answer. Next question is over here.
Can you elaborate a little bit on the client-aware cloud? I missed the Intel presentation yesterday.
Sure. So the client-aware cloud and the technology associated with that is all about defining the capabilities of the client. What can the client do? What's the footprint of the client? What's the size of the screen? What's the operating system? What's the attributes that are associated with that client? And then being able to leverage that not only to create a more dynamic workload within a cloud environment, but also to manage security. How do we leverage strong authentication as an example, knowing that it's a mobile device, knowing that it's on an insecure Wi-Fi channel, right? So client-aware cloud is not only about the capabilities of that device, but from a security perspective, about being able to leverage the attestation and the attributes that surrounding that device as it relates to the transaction that device is requesting or that it's involved in.
Another question here. Let's keep these coming.
Yes, thank you. There's a lot of talk and hype about SSO and federation in the cloud. Do you see that as the future for security?
The question is, do I see the future of security around single sign-on and single sign-on federation? I think the answer is yes. I think that over the last, call it 8 months, the industry has awoken to the possibility of SAML being the default protocol, web services protocol for handling security assertions for identity. It solves some very fundamental challenges that the enterprise has today around how do we get our employee base singly signed on to all of these cloud assets, and it's being rolled out and embraced all over the ecosystem today. What's interesting is if you look at a lot of the identity providers historically, and Intelmcafee is a large one with our technology, a lot of them previously were all focused on strong authentication, meaning they were delivering tokens and providing multi-factor authentication products. And then this problem of single sign-on with the cloud was born, and a lot of them shifted gears to provide SSO because SSO is really the foundation of all of these other identity value adds. You have to have single sign-on in order to have strong authentication, right? Or in order to put fraud detection and compliance and then have contextual aware access control and authorization models. And so it starts with SSO, and then there's a complete stack of value adds which we'll see come into the market which take advantage of that. And one of the things that the cloud security platform provides as an example is how you can take a Salesforce session and use contextual attributes to say, oh, it's a salesperson on an insecure Wi-Fi in China that's trying to access a particular asset inside of Salesforce, invoke a strong authentication session on top of that request. So yeah, I think SSO is the beginning. I think it's the carrot for the identity space, and I think that it's going to go on from there to embrace other elements of federation and value adds.
Good questions. We're out of time, but very good questions. Let's, just to the lady who was discouraged, let's think, 20 years Scott has been dealing with security. He still comes into work, so he hasn't given up. So that's the bright message from this session. Let's say thank you so much, Scott Chasin, McAfee. Don't even think of moving. We have more.